Welcome back to Political Roots. I'm Michael Starr Hopkins, your host, and I am here with none other than Jim Kessler. As Third Way's co-founder and executive vice president for policy, Jim brings a wealth of knowledge, enthusiasm, and insight to bear on issues across the spectrum, from middle-class economic prosperity to immigration, guns. Jim frequently appears as a commentator on television, radio, and in newspapers, including the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, and 60 Minutes. Jim, thanks so much for joining us.
Great to be here. How are you?
I'm good. I can't complain. Are you in DC or are you in New York right now?
I'm in DC. I'm an Eagles fan, so
tough.
Yeah.
At least you're not a Commanders fan.
Right.
You surviving all this snow and mess?
Yeah, I don't mind the snow. It's fine.
See, there we go. So I brought you on. I wanted to talk to you about third parties and how they're going to affect 2024. And I guess my first question is, what happened to Joe Manchin?
Yeah. Well, I think the reality of his state happened. I mean, if you look at it, West Virginia, once upon a time, was a reliably Democratic state.
Yeah.
It is the second most Republican state behind Wyoming in terms of its presidential voting.
Mm-hmm.
And Joe Manchin managed to remain a Democrat, during that entire time. He's now an independent.
Uh-huh.
And look, I just don't. He's a guy who I believe does not see a future for him in the state. He's not running for re-election. Look, he cast a lot of votes that helped Joe Biden pass his agenda.
He did.
And
he cast a lot of votes that hurt.
and definitely some that hurt.
Mm-hmm.
But no one had more difficult votes to cast in the Senate, Democrat or Republican, than Joe Manchin. And so I think he deserves some props for that. Ultimately he's a survivor. and he is, I think he's like a boxer in the ring who knows how to avoid getting hit in the jaw, and he's constantly moving and slipping under his opponent. And I just think there's no way out for him in West Virginia.
As someone who's not running for re-election, you would think he would be more open to taking some of the difficult votes now. I know immigration is something that he's really pushing along with Kyrsten Sinema, someone who I have been very critical of. Where do you see their place in the political spectrum now? Because both of them are former Democrats who are now independents, who have kind of taken the agenda hostage to some degree.
Yeah, and I think, with Sinema in particular, I think she made some mistakes in the last couple of years.
How so?
Look, I don't criticize her for some of the votes and some of the positions she has taken. Let's just take, for example, the filibuster, all right, in which she said she opposed the filibuster. The truth of the matter is there was never more than, say, 42 or 43 votes for eliminating the filibuster. She and Manchin were the ones that got blamed for it, but there were a lot of other senators who were like, okay, if they're going to be out front, fine. So, there were some, and on the, the Biden reconciliation bill, I thought she made a big mistake on carried interest.
Yeah.
This was a place where,
she just furthers the argument of like the corporatist K Street.
Right, exactly. And this isn't even corporatist because it's not even corporations don't care.
It's true.
It's private equity.
Mm-hmm.
So I thought that was a mistake, and that was an easy one that, Democrats could have passed. That would have raised some revenue. It would have been a good thing. On the other side of the ledger, she's one of the most effective legislators in Washington. We have a gun bill that's pretty good. It's because of her. And, some of the other bipartisan, the infrastructure bill, she got people to the table. She actually is an enormously talented legislator who I think made almost amateur errors there that may cost her her career. As for the border, look, I think Joe Biden, if we get a border deal, and I do believe we need a border deal, I'm where John Fetterman is on the border. That helps Joe Biden a great deal. And I think the only reason we may not have a border deal is because it helps Joe Biden a great deal. And Donald Trump will oppose anything that gets agreed to. Well, that's Sinema, Chris Murphy, and Jim Lankford on the Republican side that are doing that. If we get a border deal, she deserves the credit for that too. But I think she stubbed her toe a couple of times, and it could cost her.
Yeah, I'm going to get back to Sinema for 1 second because you raised the border. I've been saying that the reason we won't get a border deal is because the border is the last anchor in terms of legislative agendas for Democrats heading into 2024. Immigration is an albatross on Democrats right now.
Yeah.
What do you think Democrats do if we can't get a deal? What's the plan? And why explain to listeners why we haven't gotten a deal? Because I think there's been a lot of misinformation, and I think Democrats have been poor in messaging on the border and why we haven't been able to get things passed.
Well, we've come close to deals many, many times. The last time we truly had a huge immigration/border deal was in the 1980s. We had another, I'd say, medium-sized one in the 1990s. Let's count that one as a big deal. 25, 20, maybe 27 years since we've had legislation that's dealt with the border and immigration. No wonder every administration has problems with the border. Like, you're dealing with outdated laws. There was no such thing as texting when the last time they did a border deal. For your younger listeners.
It's like the Detroit Lions hadn't won a playoff game. Texting wasn't alive.
Exactly. All sorts of different things. And the reason why is, besides it being a difficult issue, there's always been an imbalance. And the imbalance is chaos at the border helps one party, the Republicans, and it hurts the other party, the Democrats. So on almost every occasion in which we've come close to a deal, 2006, Republicans pulled out. Now, some Democrats pulled out too. Bernie Sanders opposed that bill as well. 2013, we passed a bill through the Senate. John Boehner pulled out of the deal.
John Boehner.
After Eric Cantor lost his primary in Virginia. In 2017, Dick Durbin and Donald Trump reached an agreement in the Oval Office. Trump pulled out of it the next day. There was almost a deal about a year and a half ago with Tom Tillis and Kyrsten Sinema. Mitch McConnell pulled the plug. Now, here's some of the reasons why the dynamics could be different this time, Michael. Number one is there's something that many Democrats and enough Republicans, including Mitch McConnell, really want, and that's the Ukraine funding along with the Israel funding. So that could be a piece of it.
Would that be tying it together?
They would be tied together. The second is, and I'm going back to the Wayback Machine again to 1995/1996. If Mike Johnson is smarter than he seems to be,
Not seem to be that smart.
Okay, so there's an if there.
Fingers crossed. ...
Then he should want to cut a border deal because, as his own House Republicans have been saying over and over again, we have done absolutely nothing to take back to our constituents. Yeah. So if you go back to the Wayback Machine, 1995, 1996, Newt Gingrich cut a welfare reform deal with Bill Clinton because Gingrich felt, if I don't pass anything, I'm going to lose my majority. And he said, screw Bob Dole. Bob Dole was the likely nominee at that time. Mm-hmm. So will Mike Johnson try and keep his majority and pass a deal and say, screw Donald Trump? I don't think so. But, so that's some of the dynamics at play here.
Yeah, and Mike Johnson, he already has kind of pushed back on his caucus in terms of passing some of these stopgap measures. What do you think his outlook is as speaker? He's not someone that anyone expected to be speaker. He's not someone, he was kind of a backbencher. Where do you think he goes from here?
If I were advising him, that's another if. Then.
Yeah, right.
I would say govern like you're playing with house money, and be aggressive, and don't be afraid to lose your speakership. You probably will. So do as much as you can, cut the deals, and if there's a put up or shut up with the caucus, if they vote to depose you, so be it.
He's going to get deposed no matter what, right?
But he's either going to get deposed or lose his majority.
Yeah.
So, call the bluffs, see what happens. That's what I would do if I were him. I'd play it fast and loose.
I want to turn back to Kyrsten Sinema for a second. She's somebody who has really kind of befuddled, a word I never thought I'd use, Democrats. Because she went from like a Project Pink, anti-war, Iraq liberal to independently leaning Republican. How was that evolution possible?
Yeah. Have you ever met her? Have you ever sat down with her?
I have not. No, yeah, I will say, from everyone who I know who's actually sat down and talked to her, said that she's a very smart woman.
Yeah.
And is more principled than she gets credit for.
Yeah. So I have on a number of occasions. I haven't recently. I really haven't since the Biden administration started, and that's unusual. Like we would be natural allies.
Yeah.
We certainly were when she ran. We certainly were in the House, and just with Joe Manchin, like during the whole Build Back Better back and forth, Willie, won't we, that sort of thing. Like we always had an open door with the Manchin office. Like they would take any call at any time. You could talk to him and his staff really frequently, and appreciated that. Sinema is more closed off. She is a very interesting person. She's very intelligent. She's extremely determined, and she's an iconoclast. And so, she was what she was earlier. But in part, like her life is a journey.
Yeah, talk to me a little about her life, because I don't know if everyone knows her life story.
I mean, she was homeless.
Yeah.
She's really, like pull yourself up by your own bootstraps person.
She's a survivor.
Yeah, I'd say she's a survivor and a winner.
Mm-hmm.
She might not win this time, but she's an extraordinary human being, and she runs marathons, and like she's if you were going to draw up the picture of like this person's going to get to the United States Senate, and you had 100 people, she'd be number 101. Like you just couldn't imagine that she'd make it. Whenever I was in a conversation with her, I was previously on some national security issues. Like she came from a very different vantage point and read different things, and it was very interesting conversation. I do think she got out over her skis, and she sees herself in some ways as a John McCain on the Democratic side.
Yeah.
In a state where you can do that, right?
Yeah.
It's John McCain's state. And I just feel that she maybe she had a little bit too much hubris in her own ability to.
She drank her own Kool-Aid.
Yeah. And we were talking about Joe Manchin earlier, and I'm using like him in a boxing ring, like he knows how to not get hit.
Yeah.
Joe Manchin's in his 70s. He's been doing this for a long, long time. Sinema is not. She's also a private person. Mm-hmm. She's not a gregarious, charismatic, hey, put me on TV.
He almost seems
you'd like to be with him.
She almost seems to thumb her nose at Democrats in the press, which has been something that, for someone who, on one hand, wears a pink tutu on the floor of the Senate and the House, and who, makes gestures while she's voting on the minimum wage, shooting it down. She then at the same time wants to have this mentality of leave me alone, press. I don't want the attention. She sends these mixed signals.
Yeah. Well, she does. And look, I think that she's probably part of the leave me alone is being, a bisexual person in politics in a conservative state. And, you've got to guard yourself there. But, comparing her to Joe Manchin, like
two totally different people.
Yeah, you always know what he's thinking. It may change, but you don't get much out of Sinema's office. And like I said, when we would reach out on Build Back Better or other issues, we didn't really get much response, even from her staff, which, is unusual. That, there are Democratic offices that don't speak to Third Way or speak to me, but, I'd have an easier time getting a call back from Elizabeth Warren's office than Kirsten's office.
And I probably should have done this earlier. Tell the audience what Third Way does and kind of what the principles around it are.
Yeah, so we're a center-left think tank founded in 2005. I'm one of the 4 co-founders of Third Way. We do economic policy, national security, climate change, social policy, a lot of polling. I'd say in a lot of ways, we represent the moderate/centrist wing of the Democratic Party, both in terms of policy ideas and political ideas. We were more, let's say, the Biden, Buttigieg, Klobuchar, Jim Clyburn, Colin Allred wing of the party compared to the Bernie Sanders, AOC, Elizabeth Warren wing of the party.
Which is the perfect segue into one of my questions. Has the party gone more left, or have moderates left the Republican Party? Which is it?
If you look at the coalition of people who voted for Joe Biden in 2020, the ideology of the Biden voter, 60% of his vote came from people who were either self-identified moderates or self-identified conservatives, and only 40% from self-identified liberals/progressives. So if you look at how a Democrat gets elected nationwide, or in a state like Michigan or Pennsylvania or Arizona, that coalition, the largest part of that triangle is going to be self-identified moderates, followed by liberals/progressives, and then a little bit of conservatives there. And together, that moderate conservative is about 60%. The left wing of the Democratic Party has always been more organized, has always been louder, and I don't say that like as an insult. I say that as a strategic choice that they've made that's been very good for the left.
Yeah, for the most part.
Yes, for the most part. And then you add social media to the mix. That's really, I think, increased the decibel level of the left of the party, just as it's increased the decibel level of the right within the right-wing party. So I don't think the ideology of the electorate, let's say, has really moved to the left. But I think what elected officials who are Democrats hear from voters because of social media, because of, traditional
amplification,
that's moved left. And I think that's had an effect on the Democratic Party, and it's moved them. It can tend to move them in a leftward direction. The problem is this party is more center right than this country is more center right than center left.
Yeah.
And it's harder to elect a Democrat nationally than a Republican, particularly with the Electoral College.
Yeah, it's been interesting. So I consider myself domestic progressive. I'm very progressive on I think we should raise the minimum wage. I think everyone should have access to affordable health care. I think a woman should have a right to choose, all those things. But then when you get to foreign policy, I get way more hawkish.
Hmm.
I think that's where the base really is. If you look where the base of the Democratic Party is, especially the African American community, which is the most consistent voter in Democratic politics, does it seem like the party is more kind of progressive on domestic issues and more fiscally, more internationally relation um, conservative, or kind of where is it?
I think the party is struggling on all of those things, and I think in particular we're seeing it in the last few months with the Gaza
Mm-hmm.
situation. And if I think Joe Biden, if it was a one-on-one race, Joe Biden versus Donald Trump, I think Joe Biden would win. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
If he doesn't win, it's because young people left over Israel.
Yeah. I'm worried about that in Michigan,
In Michigan.
Georgia. I mean, Michigan especially.
Yeah.
You look at a state like Michigan where if 5% of Muslim Americans stay home, that's it. And if we lose
Yeah.
the blue wall in Michigan,
Yeah.
we're in trouble.
So I think there's some, you mentioned a bunch of issues where you say I'm progressive on domestic issues. You said raising the minimum wage. Well, I want to raise the minimum wage too. Okay. And on choice, I'm pro-choice too. So on universal affordable healthcare, I want universal affordable healthcare too. I want to do it through the ACA. Bernie wants to do it through Medicare for all.
Yeah,
But they're both different ways. A lot of times it has to do with the methodologies
absolutely.
on getting there. I do think that Democrats have struggled on, for lack of a better term, like sort of the woke,
Yeah. Mhm.
air quotes woke
Yeah.
issues, in which there's an elitist feel to it.
I talked to Joe Walsh about that very thing.
Oh yeah, of
And
course. Joe's
voters,
perfect on this.
yeah, I mean, we talked about how voters feel like Democrats have become the limousine liberals, the I love black people until they come into my schools or move into my
Right.
neighborhoods. And there is a sense of being out of touch. And I even have been guilty of that. And I used the example of fentanyl. For the longest time, I thought fentanyl was one of those things that Republicans and Fox News just talk about a lot, but isn't really this huge issue that we need to be focused on. And a lot of that's because fentanyl started in border places and in the middle of the country, worked its way out to the East Coast, the West Coast.
Yeah, the white drug.
Yeah. Now I understand what a crisis it is and how it's killed and affected hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of Americans all over the country. Is that an example of where Democrats are really out of touch because we're not seeing the effects until it's already geographically made its mark?
Yeah, I mean, I think we have that's a great example, and there are parts of the country like we just don't go to,
Mm-hmm.
and then we put a label on. Well, they're all racist there, and it's just not that simple when you go out to these places. And we were talking about immigration earlier. I'll give you a statistic. 1 out of every 8 people in this country today, 1 out of every 8 people in America were not born in America. That's a huge number of people. Okay. Yeah. That's over 40 million people. I'm part of the problem. My daughter is adopted from China. So we're part of that problem there. And you get to a certain level and some people start saying, I think this country's changing. I don't know what's going on. This doesn't feel right to me. Mm-hmm. And it might be something as simple as there's a saturation point where if you get to a certain level of foreign-born people, let's say over 1 in 10, over 10%. Yeah.
We've seen this in Maine with Somalis.
Right. Enough people start to freak out.
Mhm.
And we have more foreign-born people in our country as a percentage than any other country in the world.
Yeah.
So we're unique in that way, but it's always been a little bit of a powder keg. And in certain areas of the country, like people feel like they're changing our culture or they're changing our job. And you could say, well, that's racism or whatever term it is, but they're having a they're having a feeling that maybe you can't just put it into that box
Mhm.
so easily. A lot of people, I live in Washington, D.C., like so many people are born from it's an international city. You think like, oh, that's great.
Yeah.
It's fantastic, colorful place, lots of accents, lots of different languages, lots of different restaurants. Great. That's the way I'm self-selected. I live here.
Yeah. And I was born and raised here too. So it was foreign to me to go somewhere else and there be this idea of like, go back to where you came from. Like,
Right.
if anybody's going to go back to where they came from.
Right. What do you mean? Silver Spring? Is that
Yeah,
what
right? Sounds on a Wheaton. Like, but the changing dynamics of this country do pose an electoral issue as well, because now you have Republicans accusing Democrats of basically bringing people in to pad the votes, and
Yeah,
so
ridiculous.
yeah, which has been this big Fox narrative that's been pushed.
Yeah.
You have Tucker pushing it of the watering down of American culture. You hear Donald
Right.
Trump reference it with the poisoning of our blood.
Right. That's crossing that line, boy.
Yeah. And Democrats reject it.
Nasty.
We reject it wholeheartedly because
Yeah.
we see it for what it is. But do we need to pay attention to the underlying issue, which is that people are afraid that the America that they know, when Trump says making America great again, there is a point he's hearkening to, which
Yeah.
is for white America, this 1940s Leave It to Beaver
Yeah.
Americana, which for a lot of people in that time was a horrible time. But if you
Yeah.
were a white middle class working male,
Yeah.
it was a heyday.
Yeah, absolutely. Smoke your cigarettes, have your beer, and earn your money.
Yeah, you could make comments to your secretary about
Yeah.
her dress, and it was just okay. Everything was all
Yeah.
good.
Yeah. Putting aside how awful their talk is,
Yeah,
there's nothing we can do about their talk.
yeah,
We can look at ourselves and say, like, what are we doing that's furthering this? And I used to do this. I haven't done it in a long time, but I would a lot of times when I would speaking like publicly in front of a large audience of people and talking about immigration, I'd say, I have a deal for you. Raise your hand if you'll take it. I'll give you $1 million, but all you have to do in return is give up your American citizenship. Who would take that deal? Nobody raises their hand. And then I go up to $10 million and say, okay, $10 million. And then maybe a quarter of the room raises their hand. It's like, okay, quarter of the room, $10 million that give up their citizenship. And then I'd say, you have to realize that you think citizenship is so valuable that 75% of you wouldn't give it up even if you got $10 million. When we have a comprehensive immigration deal in which there's a path to citizenship for 10 million people who came in here illegally, you better not act like it's their right. This is a huge gift we're giving people.
yeah,
We have to say to them, like, and to the world, like, this is not easy that we're doing this. This is not what we're giving away. And if people feel that citizenship for this country is so valuable in an immigration reform or with Dreamers, you have to make it as though we're giving something very precious and we're being very generous. And therefore, we're going to solve this border problem or some of the other things that have made it so many people have gotten in here illegally. So I think I always feel like, yeah, we can look at how awful Trump is and you lose a lot of sleep over that. But what are we doing that's compounding our own image problem?
yeah. I like to ask, once you get past Trump is a vessel for Republicans, and once you get past all of the obscene, hateful rhetoric, you got to ask yourself, but why is he connecting? What is it about him? What is it about what he's saying that, yeah, people like, the chaos and crazy and whatever, but he's connecting on a visceral level. And what is it about him that's connecting? As we kind of start to wrap things up, the whole point of this is I wanted to ask you about third parties and how third parties are going to affect this election. We saw in 2020, basically the election was decided by 40,000 votes over 3 states. When you have margins that small, what role are third parties going to play in 2024?
Let's first dispel the notion that any third party candidate is going to win the election or win even a single electoral college vote.
Yeah.
The last third party candidate to win a single electoral college vote was George Wallace in 1968, running as a segregationist.
Mm-hmm.
If you add up all the third party electoral college votes won since 1900, it wouldn't equal the 270 you need to win a single election. And one of those third party candidates was Teddy Roosevelt, who was a former president and was adored. So third party doesn't win.
Yeah.
Next little stat factoid. Donald Trump won Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin in 2016. Okay.
That was the blue wall.
Yes. In 2020, Donald Trump got a higher percentage of vote in Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Michigan, but lost them to Joe Biden. And the reason why is there were third-party candidates in the race in 2016.
Jill Stein
and Gary Johnson.
That's right.
And so without a third-party candidate, for the people that are like, I can't vote for Trump and I don't want to vote for Joe Biden. Well, we just watched Iowa last night.
Mm-hmm.
People will go into -4-degree weather to vote for Donald Trump.
They will crawl over glass. They will, whatever it takes.
Exactly. And let them walk over glass. I let them do that.
Make it hurt a little bit.
Yes. I encourage you to do that, Trump supporter. Take off your shoes, walk on glass.
Right.
We know there's going to be some third-party candidates in the race. Jill Stein's going to run. Robert Kennedy is running. We'll see how many states he can get on the ballot. It ain't easy to get on the ballot.
Mm-hmm. No Democrats are going to vote for RFK, though. Like he's more likely to pull from Republicans, isn't he?
Maybe. I don't be certain.
Okay.
I think where young people could go on this. What concerns me is No Labels, which is a group from the center that is.
Are they from the center though? Because their funding is Republican.
Right. Okay, they're purportedly from the center. Okay, they're self-identified from the center. They believe in unity, bipartisan, that sort of thing, and their founders are some of the people that once upon a time were in the sort of the Bill Clinton world in the 90s. Nancy Jacobson, Mark Penn,
mm-hmm.
Her husband, Joe Lieberman,
mm-hmm.
Some others.
People who now mostly associate with Republicans.
Yes, and definitely their money is secret. I think
Harlan Crow is one of their donors, though.
I think is their largest donor.
Yeah. Harlan Crow is of Supreme Court fame for funding much of Clarence Thomas's lifestyle.
He's the 10th Supreme Court justice.
Absolutely. See, there we go.
We've expanded the Supreme Court already.
Who knew? All it cost was an RV and tuition for
right. So No Labels is, in some ways, a well-organized group that may succeed because they've been able to raise money in getting on the ballot in all 50 states. And they are threatening to run a coalition ticket of a Republican and a Democrat. They are now saying a Republican will be at the top of the ticket and a Democrat will be vice president. And our fear at Third Way, and I think it bears out by the numbers, is that for every 10 votes that they would get, probably 6 of them would come from Joe Biden and 4 would come from Donald Trump. And in an election that is going to be tight, a no labels candidacy that gets 5 or 6% of the vote, that could flip 5 or 6 states from Biden to Trump, and Trump will get elected. So, Third Way has taken the lead as an organization and has assembled a coalition that goes from the center right, like the Bulwark and the Lincoln Project, which are former Republicans.
Yeah, we had Jim Swift on the show in the last episode.
All the way to Move On.
Yeah.
And, trying to, in all sorts of different ways, challenge no labels from a political front, a legal front, policy front, and to try and convince candidates to not join their ticket and to try and convince donors not to give them money. I think we've been successful, but ultimately it just takes, the decision is no labels, not Third Ways or anybody else's. And it just takes 2 idiots, one Republican and one Democrat, who are prominent enough to form a ticket and maybe hand the election to Trump.
Now, Larry Hogan has said he's not going to run. That was someone who was rumored to be at the top of the ticket.
He's been iffy. I think Larry Hogan is, I wouldn't count him out.
And Larry Hogan is a former governor of Maryland who was twice elected, has pretty popular support among Democrats. Yep. My grandmother, who has never voted for a Republican, came very close to voting for Larry Hogan against Ben Jealous in that race.
Yeah.
Joe Manchin is someone else who's been rumored to run. He came out yesterday or day before yesterday and said that under no circumstances would he vote for President Trump,
right,
which seems like it should have been a given. But the real worry is he runs at the top of the ticket for no label.
I don't think Joe Manchin's going to run.
So that's a relief.
Yeah. I don't know definitively.
Mm-hmm.
Joe Manchin thinks Donald Trump is dangerous. He also personally likes Joe Biden, but thinks Joe Biden has been forced to the left by some of the dynamics that we talked about earlier. I think Manchin in the end will be okay.
Yeah, I would imagine he does not want his legacy to be the re-election of Donald Trump.
No.
Who should we be worried about running from no labels? Like a Dean Phillips?
I do think Larry Hogan.
You still think Hogan?
Okay. Yeah. John Huntsman. I don't think John Kasich will do it. I know No Labels has mentioned Nikki Haley.
Mm-hmm. Which would, all of these would just be pure spoilers. And so they would have to know that their point would be to spoil an election.
It might be a former military person.
Mm-hmm.
Their universe of top-tier candidates has shrunk. People like Kyrsten Sinema have all but said no. Kyrsten Sinema would have been a top-tier candidate. Chris Christie would be a top-tier candidate. He's all but said no. So I think because of the efforts that we and other organizations have done to really spoil the no labels coming out party, because almost all their press is very, very negative.
Yes.
On the defensive all the time. Prospective candidates look at this, will Google and look at all the articles and be like, oh, why would I want to join this clown show? So
do you think if Trump wasn't at the top of the ticket for Republicans, or presumed to be at the top of the ticket for Republicans, no labels would stand a better chance of fielding candidates, and third parties would stand a better chance of being able to grow and gain support?
If Nikki Haley won the nomination, I think No Labels would endorse Nikki Haley. No Labels has an okay relationship with Donald Trump.
Yeah.
They don't think he's awful. No Labels thinks Nancy Pelosi is awful and Chuck Schumer is awful.
Your former boss.
But yeah, my former boss. They didn't think Kevin McCarthy was awful. No Labels thought the January 6th committee was illegitimate.
I mean, that should tell you everything you want to know.
So, you mentioned one candidate we didn't mention was Liz Cheney, right?
Yeah.
Well, Liz Cheney won't join their effort because No Labels excoriated the January 6th committee that she was on.
Liz Cheney, out of all of this, has had, I think, the biggest plot twist. Who would have thought that Liz Cheney would be speaking at Ebenezer Baptist Church on Martin Luther King Day?
Yeah.
I mean, she went from the daughter of Dick Cheney, the Darth Vader of Republicans, to a patriot who has higher favorables among Democrats than Republicans. And even Dick Cheney, to some degree, people are kind of remembering differently. I get it for George W. Bush. I actually remember when he left office, I said to someone, I was in college at the time, I said, history will remember him better in 10 years than they remember him today, and remember him better in 20 years than they remember him in 10.
Yeah, it's really something. So I think there's a couple of lessons there. One is, politics is a mean business, and we say lots of awful things about people that are on the other side, but they're more complicated human beings than we give them credit for. Liz Cheney is the same person is today that she was 20 years ago. The other is, and I just did an interview with the New Republic on this, there's a story about like Schumer and McConnell, how the relationship is now pretty good. And that wasn't always the case.
Yeah.
And as you noted, I'm a former Schumer guy, so I get called for these articles as being the expert on
all things Schumer.
But on the number one issue, Schumer and McConnell are roughly in the same place, which is they're pro-democracy.
Yeah.
And they both think that Donald Trump is a real danger. I don't know how far Mitch McConnell's going to go. He did not go far enough.
Yeah, he wasn't willing to really go out.
He needed to take 10 steps.
Yeah.
But now there's a new number one issue for a lot of people. It's not inflation, which is important. It's not choice, which is super important. Mm-hmm. It's whether we have a functioning democracy forevermore.
And that leads me to the final question of, I've been ringing the bell and trying to warn Democrats about African-American turnout, about youth turnout, and that being the difference in the election. What advice do you give, not just Democrats, but young people, African-Americans, people who are considering not voting for Trump, not voting for Biden, but just staying home? What's your advice to them?
Yeah, you would have better advice than I would. Okay, on that. I do have a daughter who's 18, so I would remember in 2019, maybe 2020, before the Democratic primary, I was reading The Root.
Yeah.
And they were predicting that Joe Biden was going to win the nomination because they said two things. Number one, he's the only person in the race who ever called a black person boss. And the other was, he has the most important endorsement, which is your mother.
Yeah. It's true. I mean, African Americans saved the Biden campaign and delivered him the presidency. No questions asked.
So the only insight I could give, Michael, on this is, I hope the moms and dads are talking to their kids, young voters, and say, like, you got to do this. You've got to do this. You don't know how precious this country is yet. You don't know how precarious the situation we're in because you haven't lived long enough.
Mm-hmm.
But you need to do this. And that's what I hope.
Then let me ask this question a different way. what advice would you give the Biden campaign about how to secure this win for 2024?
Well, I do think they should try and get a border deal, and if they don't get a border deal, they should blame Republicans on it. I think on the economy, they need to frame it the way Ronald Reagan did, not Morning in America. That was ultimately what they got to. But Reagan, he had a terrible economy when he took office, and it got worse. And I was graduated from college in 1982. The unemployment rate was 10.8%, and inflation was over 7%. But what he said was, we have a plan. We're going to solve it. It's going to be a bumpy road. It won't happen overnight. Get on the bus. It's stormy. It's dark. It's dangerous out there. But I know how to drive this bus, and I will get you there safely. And then with each success, he'd say, it's getting better, but we're not there. It's getting better. We're not there. And I think the problem with Bidenomics, that term, is it sounded like mission accomplished.
Yeah.
When instead they need to talk about like it's under construction. And they need to point to all the improvements in the economy and all the good news and say, like, this is happening, but we're not satisfied, and we're not, and that sort of thing. And so I think that, you got to be right on immigration. I think you got to be, right on crime too.
Which is a tough one.
Yeah, which is a tough one. You've got to get the words on the economy right.
Yeah. So messaging.
Yeah.
Jim, this was such an informative interview. I really appreciate it. I could talk to you for hours, so we have got to get you back on the show.
For sure.
Thank you so much.
Let's grab lunch one of these days if you're in DC.
I'm in DC. Let's do it.
All right.
I
love you picked a spot. I'm sure you have better taste in restaurants than I do.
We'll find some good places. We'll grab a good bacon cheeseburger. And
all right.
Thank you so much, Jim Kessler.
Cheers.
Third Way. Take care.
Have a great day.
And that's a wrap on another episode of Political Roots. A special thanks to our guest, Jim Kessler of Third Way. Don't forget to stay connected with us. Follow us on Instagram and Twitter for the latest updates and news. Also, you can catch all of our episodes on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. Be sure to subscribe so you don't miss out on exclusive content. I'm your host, Michael Starr Hopkins, signing off. But the conversation doesn't end here. Join us next time on Political Roots as we continue to explore the issues that shape our world. Until next time, take care.